is some technical issue on the side of Jama Varsami. Dr. Piers Simpkin is available. So next session is here with Dr. Simpkin. Can you please come online and share with us your thoughts about the camel management in climate change and food security in Kenya, especially in the Camelus Dromedarius? He is basically the camel milk producer and Spiers consultant in the Nairobi, Kenya.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Piers Simpkin. About camels and climate change in Kenya. Just to say there are about 4.7 million camels in Kenya. This study is more taken from a literature review. And then I've also done some calculations and observations of my own in terms of looking at the impact of camels on climate change and the impact of climate change on camels. So the distribution of camels is mostly across northern Kenya. If you look at the top left-hand map, the orange area is the traditional camel keeping range. And then the red dots are basically where camels have more recently been introduced into the southern rangelands of Kenya. The map at the lower left-hand side of the screen is showing the risk of drought as a result of future climate change. So you can see that the whole camel range is very much at risk of drought in the future. And then the graph or the graphic, the larger graphic on the right, shows how vegetation, and this is edible vegetation, has changed over the years from 2000 to 2017. The green shows that there's plenty of good forage, very good forage condition. The red shows that there's an extreme vegetation deficit. So again, you can see over the last 17 years, there's been less and less recovery and less forage available in the rangelands of Kenya. The rangelands of Kenya do hold the majority of livestock in Kenya. So that's the 4.7 million camels, 20 million cattle, and 62 million sheep and goats. The predictions for climate change in Kenya indicate that temperatures, yes, will go up between 1.7 and 3.3 degrees, depending on the severity of global warming. That there'll be an increase in the number of days of heat waves, that the annual rainfall will actually increase. The annual rainfall is predicted to increase between 2 to 11% by the year 2060. But the number of the intense rainfall, the number of days with heavy rainfall will also increase. So there will be a greening effect, but there will also be more runoff and flooding. The projections are that income for livestock keepers, whether they're large or small livestock enterprises, will decrease as a result of climate change. The graphic here is also showing the risk of flood in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see there are some parts of the camel range which do have risks of flooding, and I'll come back to that shortly. In terms of the graphics on the right hand of the screen, this is from Ogutu et al. In 2016. We've already seen since the 1970s a slight decline in rainfall over the years and a slight increase in the temperature, the minimum and maximum temperatures. So what is this? What impact is this having on the livestock numbers in Kenya? Again, data taken from aerial surveys by Ogutu and his colleagues in 2016 have shown that the top left graphic shows that the green line is the total number of livestock units in the northern counties of Kenya. And you can see the green line has declined slightly, but is pretty static and steady. Whereas the red line is the human population increase. So we've had a slight decrease in animal numbers totally, but a huge increase in the human population. If we look in more detail at the mix of that population, the mix of species, on the bottom left, the small map, you can see it's mostly red and orange, which indicates a massive reduction in the number of cattle. The middle graphic shows an increase in the sheep and goats. And then the right-hand graphic is the camel population, which overall shows a big increase, except in a few counties. And those differences are probably more due to migration rather than a total reduction in camel numbers. What we have seen from this data is that the cattle numbers have reduced by 30%, and that gap has been filled by an increase in sheep and goats by 300%. If we look at the climate change and the emissions of gases from the livestock sector in Kenya, the livestock emissions are very low compared to most developed countries. And again, the majority of emissions are being emitted from the cattle and beef industry. Camels are estimated to be producing about 9.4% of the methane emissions, and total emissions only 3.7%. That's less than the sheep and goat population. So again, relatively low emissions. But if we look at the literature, Rogers and Downing in 2017 were saying that the major greenhouse gas emissions through respiration, enteric fermentation, and excretion, that's the major cause of global changing in the livestock sector. How do camels contribute to this? I've only found one report in the literature by Dittman and others in 2014, which shows that camels actually produce less greenhouse gas emissions compared to other ruminants. The next source of emissions is the manure. And this could be a problem with the camel system because the manure is not treated, it's just left on the rangelands. But again, the manure is dry and hard, so it's probably not producing as much emissions or greenhouse gases as the cattle and the more intensive systems. In terms of emissions due to animal production, the transport, the feed, and processing, that's not really going to be a major problem in Kenya because it's very free range, but it is likely to increase as demand for products and intensification takes place. And then the last contribution from livestock is the change in land use, the cultivation, the deforestation, leading to carbon soil losses. Again, this can be a risk if overgrazing by camels occurs. Certainly there is overgrazing by other species, but camels tend to be a very conservative feeder, taking a bite here and there and moving on. However, what we do have to be careful with is that all of the greenhouse gas emissions and the comparisons made are normally in terms of CO2 equivalent per kilogram of meat or per litre of milk produced. And this is where perhaps we need to be cautious in saying that the camel is the best there is, because to produce 1 litre of milk, the average global greenhouse gas emissions is 2.8 kilograms per litre of CO2 equivalent. In European and North American intensive milk producing systems, it's only 1.6 to 1.9 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per litre, whereas in the pastoral system in sub-Saharan Africa, we're producing 9 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per litre of milk. So we need to identify how we can improve on that in terms of the emissions intensity in order to improve our record in terms of camels being one of the better species for combating climate change. So what's the impact of climate change on camels? This is for Kenya specifically. Yes, we've seen temperatures will increase. The main effect of this is also going to be, well, not only more frequent drought, but also a higher variability in the rainfall, making agriculture and diversification particularly difficult. We're likely to see a spread and the frequency in outbreaks of vector-borne diseases, particularly Rift Valley fever and blue tongue virus carried by mosquitoes, and then also some of the tick-borne diseases, which currently camels do not suffer so badly from, but up to 50% of the tick species may expand their range and might start affecting camels more seriously. On the positive side, the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide does favor an increase in tree and shrub growth compared to grass. So that would be an advantage to camels. What do we know about the adaptation and advantages of camels at the moment? We all know they're highly adaptable through their anatomical, behavioral, and metabolism. They can cope with deficits in forage and vegetation. They can continue grazing even if temperatures are higher, partly due to their thermolabile abilities. They're also a selective and low impact feeder, and they feed particularly on bushes, trees, and weeds. So that could be to their advantage. It's also clear that they have lower water needs in terms of milk production. And I've got some figures here which show that cattle and goats in northern Kenya, I hope you can hear me, that the camels per tropical livestock unit of camel are only consuming 0.9 cubic meters of water per year, whereas cattle are taking at least double of that, 3 times that, 2.8 cubic meters per tropical livestock unit per year. And surprisingly, sheep and goats are even higher, almost 5 times higher. So in terms of water scarcity and climate change, camels will be the most efficient. In terms of milk production per dry matter intake, you can see from the 2 tables on the right, if we look at the second table, the last 2 rows of the second table, in terms of annual milk production per tropical livestock unit per year, camels are producing 865 milliliters of milk, compared to much lower 125 milliliters and 88 milliliters per goat. So in terms of converting food into milk, the camels are far more efficient in the dry desert areas of Kenya. And you can see at the bottom there that Stiles estimated that they're 5 times more efficient at converting milk to human use on an annual basis on natural vegetation. What is not quite so clear, although the last row shows that the adjusted annual milk production, this takes into account the calving intervals and that you only get 1 calf every 2 years, we're still getting far more milk yield from camels per kilogram of dry matter intake compared to cattle and sheep and goats, 378 compared to 62 and 39. However, the big gap where the red question marks are is that we really don't have any information on the life cycle milk production. So although Dr. Azig says, yes, they have a long reproductive life, this could actually be a disadvantage in terms of their late maturation, their long calving intervals. It means that the amount of carbon dioxide given off, the greenhouse gas emissions, will be greater because we're waiting longer before they become productive. So those are areas we need to look into. Finally, I think we can expect that climate change impact on camels is likely to be less than it is on other livestock species in Kenya and compared to crop farmers. The main threat is climate variabilities, but camels are already well adapted to this. The greening effect of extra and associated flooding due to the higher, more intense rainfall may lead to a spread in the range of ticks and parasites and insect vectors and the risk of Rift Valley fever, which does cause abortions, losses in production, and through market closures can have a big impact on the value of camel keeping. But that again is increasingly manageable. The increasing temperatures and longer dry seasons with increased drought frequency may reduce milk yields and growth rates, but this may be compensated for by the increased shrub and bushy vegetation, increase in that compared to the grasses. Perhaps the biggest threat is the human response to climate change and the increasing demand for milk and meat in East Africa, which will lead to a trend in intensification and conversion of the rangelands into monocropping or fodder production systems, which will be detrimental to camels. But much more research is required. We need to look at the life cycle productivity studies on greenhouse gas emissions of camels compared to other livestock species, and compared to the intensive systems. But we shouldn't, and we should be lobbying against only measuring climate change in terms of the CO2 emitted per litre or kilogram of milk. If it remains like that, camels will always struggle to compete against the intensive Holstein farming systems, which are much more economical in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But my argument is that we should be looking at the medicinal value of the milk, the cultural importance of the animal, the biodiversity of its rangeland and environment, and the ecosystem benefits that the environment that camels maintain provides to people and populations. But we do need to address the slow maturation rate, the long calving intervals. And in Kenya, I believe we have negative selection. We tend to milk the low producing females for much longer, whereas the other way around. We milk the low producing females for a much shorter period, whereas the high yielding females, we milk for a much longer period. So the calving intervals are longer, we get fewer calves. So that to me ends up with negative selection. Again, we need to look at community-driven efforts in terms of better and organized grazing that offers carbon sequestration rather than overgrazing and soil carbon loss. So that's a summary of my findings on climate change and camel production and food security in Kenya. Back to you for the coordination, or to Jamar for the next paper. Thank you very much.